recording. Right, hi everyone. I'm Joan Lacqua. I'm Executive Director of the History Project, and I'm so happy to welcome you here tonight for tonight's event in collaboration with the National Park Service. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a couple of plugs for the History Project. First of all, for those of you who don't know us or might not be familiar with our work, we are Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We are a volunteer-driven organization. We've been around since 1980, documenting, preserving, and sharing LGBTQ history. We are here most Thursday nights doing virtual programming during the pandemic and likely after. And so if you enjoy tonight's event, please be sure to follow us on social media, to open the emails that we send you, and to come back. We have something really exciting planned for LGBTQ History Month next month. So keep an eye on the transom. So the two plugs I have before the speakers start are, first of all, we are still working on our crowdsourced project, #QueerArchivesAtHome. So if you haven't opened up your closet and found some LGBTQ history that you've been hanging on to, please do. Please take pictures of, or send us pictures, videos, stories, so that we can share in each other's experiences while we can't physically meet each other in the archives. My second plug is for your support. Like I mentioned, we're a volunteer-driven community archives. A donation at any amount really helps us. And thank you to all of you who have already donated to support the organization. If you're interested, a recurring donation of any size is particularly helpful because it gives us the security to take long-term steps towards a sustainable future for the archives and for queer history in Boston. Those are my plugs. So without further ado, tonight's speakers are Meaghan, Michael, and Kate Potter. Meaghan has worked at Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site since 2018. She has a primary focus on researching and interpreting the LGBTQ history of the house. She previously worked at the National Parks of Boston, Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park, and Gettysburg National Military Park, and she's currently working on her bachelor's degree in history. And then we have Kate Potter. She's in her 4th season at Longfellow House. She has a bachelor's degree in English Lit and completed her master's degree in museum studies in 2020. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Her capstone paper focused on the interpretation of queer history at historic house museums. So here we are.
So hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. At least in the Boston area, it is a rainy, rainy night. So I am at least am very glad that we didn't have to go anywhere to give you this lecture. So the next hour or so is going to be an introduction to some of the symbols and themes in queer literature of the 19th century. And this is an introduction. That is the most important word here. There was a lot that we wanted to put in. There was a lot that we had to cut. There is a recommended reading slide at the very end. Like Joan said, if you have questions at any point during our talk, feel free to toss them in the chat, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at the end of the program for question and answers. So with that, Ranger Meaghan, take it away.
Alrighty, so like Kate said, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really, before we dive into the 19th century, I am going to have to give a minor crash course on the references that would have been popular with male writers of the 19th century. And in fact, that is kind of where we got part of our talk from, was a quote from the classics, Sappho, who wrote, "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." But Sappho was definitely not the most popular reference that we had at that point. Really, the popular reference at that point was the Greeks in general. In the 19th century especially, the classics was really starting to become formalized in universities in a way that it hadn't before. It also became a lot more accessible as well. In the 1840s, the classics really started focusing on the works of Plato and that sort of thing at Oxford. And in the 1850s through 1870s, Harvard really started to focus on the teachings of Plato and Socrates as well. And what this meant is students were reading these stories firsthand. They were not being censored, they were reading the originals in the original languages. And this allowed them to learn about things that weren't quite so accessible up to that point. Mainly the concept of Greek love. And this is going to be referenced constantly in works throughout the 19th century, especially the works of Socrates and Plato specifically. Socrates is really the one who came up with the concept of our modern understanding of Greek love, which encompasses an older man guiding a younger man, also known as pederasty. This generally means an older man and a teenager. This was something that people in the 19th century were reading, and this was really the only classical reference point they had. So this is sort of what they are bouncing their own thoughts and ideas off of as well. And really the two works that are going to be most important for them is going to be Phaedrus and Plato's Symposium. There's also going to be a lot of allusions to lovers from Greek times as well, both in history and in mythology. And those are going to come up quite a bit too. But this is just the start of some of the references. We also have other popular references that would have been used in the 19th century as well. For Roman history, you do have Virgil, you do have Catullus. There are some references to the Bible as well with Saint Sebastian and David and Jonathan. But there's also more contemporary references as well, especially Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a few years earlier, the works of William Shakespeare. So this is really going to be the bouncing off point for queer literature of the 19th century, especially since the 19th century is really where the novel starts to become fully mainstream. And it's around this time that because the novel is becoming popular, you can start slipping your own allusions in. And this provided a golden opportunity for queer stories to be told, using a lot of the coded references that I just pointed out. And some are going to be a lot more blatant and obvious than others. So to really begin, I wanted to start with talking a little bit about Herman Melville. Herman Melville was born in New York City, and he already had a very exciting life long before he started writing. He originally joined a whaling vessel, sailed throughout the South Pacific, ended up jumping ship, went AWOL for a while, joined another ship, helped a mutiny, he was arrested, and then he managed to escape. He then joined the Navy and finally made his way back to America. And as soon as he got home, his friends and family encouraged him to write about these experiences. And so he did. His first big hit was the novel Typee, quickly followed by a very successful novel called Umu. But the one he's most famous for is Moby Dick. And this is really where I want to start to dive into queer history and queer literature. Moby Dick is going to draw a lot of inspiration from his own experiences. It's also going to draw a lot of inspiration from the stories he read and the history surrounding the whaling industry. But it also is going to be heavily inspired by a man named Nathaniel Hawthorne. I cannot begin to overstate how much of an influence Hawthorne was on Melville and his writing. We're never going to know the full extent of what this relationship was, but what is clear is that Melville absolutely adored him. He truly loved him, and enough so that he even ended up moving to Western Massachusetts to live closer to Nathaniel Hawthorne. We unfortunately only have a handful of letters that Melville wrote to him. We don't have any that Hawthorne wrote back. As Hawthorne's son wrote, Melville scrupulously destroyed them all. And if anyone in this chat has had to study LGBT history before, destroying letters is a very common theme at this point. Unfortunately, the friendship wasn't to last. The two of them met in 1850, but by 1851, something had driven a wedge in this relationship. But in 1851, that's when Moby Dick was published, and the book was dedicated to Hawthorne himself. And so I feel like the backstory is important to understanding the literature. A lot of these books can stand on their own, but understanding the context is important too. So with that, let's get into Moby Dick itself. Really, what I'm going to focus on is the main relationship between the narrator, Ishmael, and a man named Queequeg. And the relationship starts to grow for the first few chapters until we get to chapter 10, A Bosom Friend, where Melville writes, "He seemed to take to me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I to him. And when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said that henceforth we were married," meaning, in his country's phrase, that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me, if need should be. But what's important about this chapter is this is not the only reference to a marriage that occurs. A few paragraphs down, there's another reference talking about the fact that they then spend the night on their heart's honeymoon. And that's really going to be the biggest reference that Melville has in the story. He doesn't necessarily reference the Greeks, he doesn't necessarily reference the classics. He's just explicitly calling this relationship a marriage, calling them a loving pair. And this is just the first major instance. Many chapters later, because this book has hundreds of them, we have chapter 72, The Monkey Rope, where Melville writes, "So that for better or for worse, we two, for the first time, were wedded, and should poor Queequeg sink to rise no more, then in both usage and honor demanded that instead of cutting the cord, it should drag me down in his wake." This is not just referencing the concept of marriage, this is referencing marriage vows themselves, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. But with this relationship, not even death can separate them. This is very much, if one of them dies, the other dies with him. That's how strong the bond is. So really, marriage as a metaphor is going to be one of the recurring themes of this novel. There is one other quote that I do need to reference, and I am hoping I can say this one with a straight face, because this one has nothing to do with marriage at all. And this one is from chapter 94, A Squeeze of the Hand. "Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. All the morning long, I squeezed that sperm till I myself almost melted into it. I squeezed that sperm till a strange sort of insanity came over me, and I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborers' hands in it, mistaking their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this advocation beget, that at last I was continually squeezing their hands and looking up into their eyes sentimentally, as much as to say, 'Oh, my dear fellow beings, why should we longer cherish any social acerbities or know the slightest ill humor or envy? Come, let us squeeze hands all round. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. Let us squeeze ourselves universally into the very milk and sperm of kindness.'" I can't see people's reactions, but this one is pretty blatant. What Melville is technically referencing is removing the whale oil from a spermaceti, from a sperm whale, but that is not what seems to be written here. And if this sounds very inappropriate, people picked up on that even then. This really was the passage of Moby Dick, where people who were accustomed to romantic friendships, who maybe wouldn't have really given a second thought to the marriage portions of this book, questioned what was going on in this section. And for future reading references, this is not the only time that Herman Melville used masturbation as a metaphor, which is another thing I never expected to say at my job. It's not just Moby Dick, it is Redburn, it is Pierre, and it's also White Jacket. So don't have time to go into all of those, but future reading if you're interested. We're gonna let the whale go away now. And to really kind of wrap up Moby Dick and sort of Melville's story, in the end, the love story, and however you want to interpret it, is entirely up to you. But all the same, the love story between Ishmael and Queequeg does end in tragedy. Queequeg does end up dying, but Ishmael himself only survives because of him. In the book Gay Literature, The Male Tradition, the author writes that Melville was not able to imagine what it might have been like for two men to love each other and survive. And to a certain extent, that was based off of his own personal experiences. He and Nathaniel Hawthorne barely spoke to one another again after Moby Dick was published, though Hawthorne himself did love the novel. And he himself even referenced the complexities of their relationship in his own novel, The Blithedale Romance. But when Hawthorne died in 1864, Melville wrote this in memory of him, and it wasn't actually published until after Melville died in 1891. To have known him, to have loved him after loneness long, and then to be estranged in life, and neither in the wrong. And now for death to set his seal, ease me, a little ease, my song. So that is a bit of Melville's story, and there's a lot more we could dive into there, but I want to move on to the next figure I want to talk about, which is probably the most influential author and poet of queer literature in the mid-19th century, and that is Walt Whitman. What's going to be specifically important about Walt Whitman is he's really the only truly working class person that we are able to fit into this particular lecture. There was a lot we had to cut down for this. And so Whitman is going to be writing about the working classes. He's going to have a focus on democracy and equality in his poetry. And despite the fact that he had sort of a very poor upbringing, he stopped going to school at age 11, he was very well read. And one of the things he read quite a bit of was works by the Transcendentalists, most significantly, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson, in turn, most of his writings were inspired by Plato. So this is really the first chance we get to dive into those classical references. Whitman himself was a disciple of Emerson, writing, "My ideas were simmering and simmering, and Emerson brought them to a boil." And that boil wound up being a collection of poems known as Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass would honestly become one of the most influential poems in American history, collection of poems. And what's really striking about it is not only the fact that it contains poetry about same-sex love, it writes quite a bit about how this is what is truly American. This is what the future of America should be. As historian Susan Furentos writes, "Many people who desired others of the same sex saw in Whitman a kindred spirit. His poetry spoke of the potential of the nation. For some, the imagery he chose spoke of a different potential, where those who loved their own sex were essential members of the democratic whole." And this is not even a modern ahistorical view trying to push a sort of queer view or queer agenda on Walt Whitman. People at the time were writing to him for and against him about this, with one reviewer, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, accusing Whitman of that horrible sin not to be mentioned among Christians. And what he meant by that, of course, was sodomy. Leaves of Grass would go through many editions, but the most significant of those being his famous Calamus poems, which weren't actually in the original set. There's two passages of Leaves of Grass that reference love. One of them is Children of Adam, and that's really love between men and women. The other is Calamus, which is entirely love between men. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'm only going to share a couple of these, but I did pick some of my favorites. The first one I wanted to share is Whoever you are holding me now in hand. But just possibly with you on a high hill, first watching lest any person for miles around approach unawares, or possibly with you sailing at sea, or on the beach of the sea or some quiet island, here to put your lips upon mine I permit you, with the comrade's long-dwelling kiss or the new husband's kiss, for I am the new husband, and I am the comrade. Or if you will, thrusting me beneath your clothing, where I may feel the throbs of your heart or rest upon your hip, carry me when you go forth over land or sea, for thus merely touching you is enough, is best, and thus touching you would I silently sleep and be carried eternally. This is definitely one of Whitman's more sensual poems. He definitely pushed boundaries in regards to how explicit he was getting in his poetry. But what's especially interesting about this poem is the clear sense of hesitancy and the fear of getting caught, especially in the first couple of lines, that kissing him was something scandalous, that it was something you had to hide. You needed to check to make sure nobody was around you. And yet, despite all of that, it's something that is done anyway. And this one is a bit more neutral. He's writing from a universal perspective. He's really covering all his bases with this poem, talking about a wife kissing her new husband or a man kissing his best friend. And this, again, is very explicit. But this is just one of the Calamus poems. My favorite one is this one, When I Heard the Close of Day. And much like most of Whitman's poems, it's pretty long, so I did just section out the ending. But the basic premise of the beginning is he's very sad. He's miserable. He can't make himself happy. Nothing seems to matter in life until he finds out that his friend is coming home. And with the next at evening came my friend. And that night, while all was still, I heard the waters roll slowly, continually up the shores. I heard the hissing rustle of the liquid and sands as directed to me, whispering to congratulate me. For the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cool cover in the cool night. In the stillness in the autumn moonbeams, his face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly around my breast. And that night I was happy. And what I really love about this one is just how romantic it is. The fact that he's writing about another man, and he's just talking about how being in bed with him, getting to sleep by his side, made him happier than he had been in months. And it's definitely one of the ones that struck me the most when I read it. But there are dozens of poems very much in the similar vein. And students who studied Whitman saw his poems as a reflowering of Greek love. It became actually a popular present to give to someone you were interested in. And Leaves of Grass took on a coded reference of its own. If a man gave another man a copy of Leaves of Grass, it was meant as sort of a romantic gesture at that point. And to bring it to our own site, One of Whitman's sort of students was actually Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's little brother, Sam. And talking about his conversations with Sam, Whitman actually wrote, "A way back, he was a student of Leaves of Grass. I was told liked it, called it Greek. Said it was the most Greek of moderns, or something like that. Others have made similar comparisons. Sam, however, was not, as I understood him, making allusions so much to the forms, to the spirit of the book. The underlying recognition of facts which were the peculiar property of the Grecian." So basically, Sam and Whitman were having conversations talking about the fact that this was very much in the spirit of Greek love. And Sam Longfellow was not the only one to pick up on this. Another person who picked up on it was Oscar Wilde. And Wilde even wrote, "There is something so Greek and sane about Whitman's poetry. It is so universal, so comprehensive." So as you can probably figure out, the next person we're going to be discussing is Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde, early in his career, was really famous for being famous. He did write a book of poetry, which was very successful, but he really starts to gain popularity in the late 1880s. And Oscar Wilde is especially a person where historical context is vital. By the end of the 19th century, the United States and Britain were undergoing rapid changes through urbanization, industrialization, shifting gender roles, and sexuality. The idea of same-sex attraction as a whole was beginning to shift, both positively and negatively. Before, it was viewed as a set of behaviors. It was something you did. By this point in history, it was starting to be considered something that was inherently a part of you. It was something you were. And this meant that homosexuality was brought into the mainstream in ways that had kind of been under the radar before. And this was the era that Oscar Wilde was writing in. And though he's often a comic writer, a lot of that does play through. And the most significant of this to really showcase this is going to be the picture of Dorian Gray. And two things that are important to this are two major historical events that helped inspire it. The first one was the Labouchere Amendment of 1885, which made gross indecency a crime, basically having relations with another man. And in 1889, the Cleveland Street scandal broke out when a male brothel was discovered by police, and many men implicated had to flee the country. The picture of Dorian Gray was published a few months after this event, and the Cleveland Street scandal was definitely central to a lot of this book. But that's really the main takeaway. This is current events. So to very quickly dive into the picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde was educated at Oxford. Out of all of the people I discussed, he really is the one with the most formal education and the one with the most advanced education. So he's going to be throwing a lot of references into this book. In chapter 1, he writes, "I see things differently, think of them differently. I can now recreate life in a way that was hidden from me before. Unconsciously, he defines for me the lines of a fresh school, a school that is to have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek, the harmony of body and soul, how much that is. We in our madness have separated the two and have invented a realism that is vulgar, an ideality that is void. Harry, if you only knew what Dorian Gray is to me." A little while later, he writes a bit more about why the main character, Basil, can no longer show off his artwork of Dorian. And the coded reference really is that he doesn't want people to learn the truth about him, which is less classical, but just as blatant. In chapter 2, we have another reference to the Greek classics. I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal, it may be. But the bravest man amongst us is afraid of himself. But most significantly, I think, is going to be chapter 10, because this is where he's no longer using classical references. He's straight out coming out and saying what this relationship could have been. The love that he bore him, for it was really love, had nothing in it that was not noble and intellectual. It was not that mere physical admiration of beauty that is born of the senses and dies when the senses tire. It was such love as Michelangelo had known, and Montaigne, and Winckelmann, and Shakespeare himself. Yes, Basil could have saved him, but it was too late now. And these are just samplings of the references I had. Again, I really had to cut this down a bit, but really, this story was blatant. And it was blatant enough that it would actually be used against him down the line. A few years later, Oscar Wilde would go on trial, initially suing the Marquess of Queensberry for libel because Queensberry had accused Wilde of being a homosexual. The plea of justification that Queensberry countered with cites Dorian Gray as one of the reasons why Oscar Wilde was a queer man, writing, "The said Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, in the month of July, in the year of our Lord 1890, did write and publish a certain immoral and obscene work in the form of a narrative entitled The Picture of Dorian Gray, which said work was designed and intended by the said Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, and was understood by the readers thereof to describe the relations, intimacies, and passions of certain persons of sodomitical and unnatural habits, tastes, and practices." Wilde would be charged with gross indecency, and he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, which was the maximum sentence for that charge. And in case you think that this is all ancient history, Oscar Wilde himself was only pardoned in 2017. So this still has, to a certain extent, modern present-day ramifications. But this is just some of what we can talk about. I want to turn this lecture over to my colleague Kate now to dive into other important aspects of this.
So you may have realized that all of the people that Meaghan was talking about were men. Queer ladies were writing as well. But before I get into my two examples, I want to sort of draw out a couple of points that Meaghan made. In the 1890s, first decade of the 20th century, there was that conception shifting of what homosexuality was. It shifted from something that you did to something that you were. And there was an idea going around of inversion, that a gay man was actually a woman on the inside, and a gay woman was actually a man on the inside. And if you are thinking, golly, that sounds a lot like how we talk about gender identity today. Yes, it is. Gender and sexuality as concepts were much more closely linked than they are today. But what's fascinating about this idea of inversion is that about 50, 60 or so years earlier, Julia Ward Howe had hit upon some of these exact same concepts. Julia Ward Howe was not herself queer, as far as we can tell. She was, however, married to a man, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was in a romantic friendship with Charles Sumner. And that, in and of itself, not necessarily a problem. The problem comes from the fact that Samuel Gridley Howe put a lot more energy into that romantic friendship with Sumner than he did with his marriage with Julia. Julia and Sam were married in 1843. Sometime late 1843, 1844, Julia wrote, "Sumner ought to have been a woman and you to have married her." So she knows exactly what's going on. She knows where her husband's affections lie. And by 1846, 1847, she's starting to put some of this down on paper. She writes a novel called, or that has been since called, The Hermaphrodite. The Sleeping Hermaphroditus was an ancient sculpture. And this novel is about a person named Lawrence. Lawrence might be referred to as intersex today. Over the course of Lawrence's life, sometimes they present as a man, sometimes they present as a woman. They have relationships with men, they have relationships with women. And this portrait of Lawrence is really sympathetic. It's the story of a person who's just kind of trying to find a place where they can be who they really are. This novel was not published in Julia's lifetime. She actually didn't even finish it. She kind of used it to work out a lot of her thoughts and feelings, just trying to wrap her head around what on earth was going on with her husband's sexuality. It kind of languished in amongst the rest of her papers at Houghton until it was discovered in 2004 when Professor Gary Williams added scholarly bits in an introduction and published it. And we wanted to have some sort of trans representation in this talk, and the hermaphrodite is as close as we could get to that concept in the 19th century. The other thing about Julia is she is a woman who is writing about sexuality for herself. She's writing about sexuality not for publication, and that is something that she has in common with the person on the next slide, Meaghan, if you would. One of my favorites, Emily Dickinson. That daguerreotype of Emily Dickinson was taken when she was a teenager. It's the only 100% verified image of her that exists. There are a couple more daguerreotypes that have come up that are probably her, but since it's not 100% sure, I went with this one. Emily was born in December 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, lived there her entire life. She did travel outside of Amherst a little bit, making a couple trips to Cambridge, went down to Washington, D.C. at one point. I'm actually going to stop myself there because looking at my notes, there's more that I wanted to say. Another thing that Meaghan mentioned was class. Walt Whitman grew up working class. Herman Melville was in reduced circumstances, genteel poverty, the 19th century phrase. Dickinson and the next person I'm talking about, Sarah Orne Jewett, were really middle class, upper middle class. And we know about these people, specifically we know about Emily and Sarah Orne Jewett because of their writing. We know about a lot of queer people only because of their writing, and it's really important to bear in mind the privilege that goes with that. The queer men that Meaghan is talking about, the universities existed as this separate, set aside, all-male world that was not part of daily life. And it was a world, the point and purpose of which was to talk about the classics. So it was very easy for this system of references to grow and kind of build upon itself. There really didn't exist anything like that for women until the mid-19th century and onward. Certainly there were convents and abbeys that existed as 100% female enclaves, but they had a very different purpose. There are examples of lesbians and queer women in convents and abbeys and nunneries throughout the Renaissance, but it was just a different rationale. So everything that Meaghan said about this codified system of references, kind of scrap it when you're looking at queer literature or queer women's literature. The best way that I've been able to find to tell if a novel or a poem that was written by a woman in the 19th century, how to tell if it's queer, look at it in the context of her life and look at it in the context of her biography. Now we can get back to Emily Dickinson. She published only about 10 poems during her lifetime. She wrote about 1,789 of them. And poetry was a way for Emily to interact with and correspond with her intimates, particularly Sue. Sue, also known as Susan Huntington Gilbert Dickinson. Yes, Sue eventually became Emily's sister-in-law by marrying her brother Austen. At an early point in their lives, Sue and Emily were extremely, extremely close. There are several letters, lots of letters back and forth between them. And what's really interesting about reading these letters is that they echo, or the letters and some of the poems echo each other. So again, Meaghan, if you would be so kind. This is a letter that was written to, from Emily to Susan in February of 1852. It's a sorrowful morning, Susie, and the wind blows and it rains. Into each life some rain must fall, and I hardly know which falls fastest, the rain without or within. Oh, Susie, I would nestle close to your warm heart and never hear the wind blow or the storm beat again. Is there any room for me there, or shall I wander away all homeless and alone? But what can I do towards you? Dearer you cannot be, for I love you so already that it almost breaks my heart. Perhaps I can love you anew every day of my life, every morning and evening. Oh, if you will let me, how happy I shall be. I chose this letter partially because Emily is quoting Longfellow there. Into each life some rain must fall is from the rainy day. But also, again, Meaghan, if you would, this is remarkably similar to Wild Nights, which is one of Dickinson's most famous poems. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Feudal the winds to the heart and port, done with the compass, done with the chart, rowing in Eden, but the sea, might I but moor tonight in thee. So there's the wild nights, rainy, windy weather, and this image of kind of cuddling in bed with someone, curling up next to Susie's warm heart, and that line about, if I could curl up next to you and not have to go out anywhere again, feudal the winds to a heart and port, done with the compass, done with the chart. She's home, she's done, she's safe, mooring tonight with Sue. And this is a photograph of Susan Gilbert. So it's just that middle stanza, particularly, that really echoes the letter. And there's another really great letter from June of 1852, a couple months later. This is a lengthy passage, but it's a good one. Before this passage in the letter, Emily is telling Susan about a conversation that she'd had with Sue's sister, Maddie, about life and love and marriage. Emily's about 20, 21 here. You and I have been strangely silent upon this subject, Susie. We have often touched upon it, and as quickly fled away, as children shut their eyes when the sun is too bright for them. I have always hoped to know if you had no dear fancy illumining all your life, no one of whom you murmured in the faithful ear of night, and at whose side in fancy you walked the lively day. And when you come home, Susie, we must speak of these things. How dull our lives must seem to the bride, and the plighted maiden whose days are fed with gold, and who gathers pearls every morning. But to the wife, Susie, sometimes the wife forgotten, our lives perhaps seem dearer than all others in the world. Goes on for a bit, extended metaphor. It does so rend me, Susie, the thought of it when it comes, that I tremble lest at some time I too am yielded up. Susie, you will forgive me my amatory strain. It has been a very long one, and if this saucy page did not here bind and fetter me, I might have had no end. So, first off, one of the common arguments that, romantic friendships aren't actually relationships or lesbian partnerships as we think of them today is that they are purely platonic. It's just how people expressed their friendships back then. In college, the roommate I had my sophomore year, we were, still are, very, very good friends. People thought we were dating, we weren't. I love her to pieces. I would never call out an amatory strain in my writing. I just want to draw attention to that particular phrase, that there's close female friendship and then there's something else. And this letter falls squarely into the something else category. Now that we've got that out of the way, in the letter, Emily lays out these three kind of different points in a woman's life. There's the bride, or different phases: bride, plighted maiden, and wife. These are three different things. And she jumps straight to the wife. Our lives. That's really where she's imagining herself and Sue. And if you would, Meaghan? This is another of Emily's more famous poems. Title divine is mine, the wife without the sign, acute degree conferred on me, Empress of Calvary, royal all but the crown, betrothed without the swoon God sends its women when you hold garnet to garnet, gold to gold, born, bridled, shrouded in a day, try victory. My husband, women say, stroking the melody, is this the way? So again, we have this jumping to the state of being a wife without the sign, without the external shows of it. And that's a constant throughout the poem. Emily is, in this poem, she is something without the external show of it. Betrothed without the swoon. So she's betrothed without the emotions. She's royal without the crown. There's the echoes of gold and gems between the letter and the poem. And here, this is really a poem that's talking about a marriage ceremony, holding garnet to garnet, gold to gold. It's two people both wearing wedding rings holding hands. And just jumping straight over that ceremony to being a wife. They're different things, a wedding and marriage. And the other interesting thing about this poem is that holding garnet to garnet, gold to gold, born, bridled, shrouded in a day, from beginning to end, heterosexual marriage can also be death or murder, or the end of a woman's life, bridled, shrouded. One bit of commentary that I was reading about this poem also pointed out the homonym of bridled, B-R-I-D-A-L-L-E-D, this word that she possibly coined in the poem, of being brided and bridled as you do to a horse. So marriage, you don't need all that. Just skip to the good part of being a wife, having a wife, and skip this whole marriage thing that can really just hold a woman back and in fact kill her. What's really interesting about that point of heterosexual heterosexual marriage being death for a woman, it's fascinatingly similar to an entry that Sarah Orne Jewett made in her journal at one point when she was a teenager. So Meaghan, if you would. Sarah Orne Jewett, the last writer that I'll talk about today. Jewett was born in September of 1849 up in South Berwick, Maine. Her house is now owned by Historic New England. Plug, when the world opens up again, I highly, highly recommend going to visit it. They do a fantastic tour up there at the Jewett house. But when Sarah was a teenager, one of her cousins got married. And when Sarah was writing about this, it was as if her cousin had died. That, cousin maiden name was no more, and now there was this Mrs. married name. Who was this person? So in many ways, Sarah is similar to Emily. They are both the daughters of leading families in particular small New England towns, Amherst, Mass. Versus South Berwick, Maine. Sorry, my train of thought just completely fell off the rails for a moment. Sarah was a regionalist, publishing novels such as Deep Haven, A Country Doctor, and The Country of the Pointed Firs. And men are not really characters in Sarah Orne Jewett's fiction, nor were they really characters in her life. Her journal as a teenager displays lots of really passionate attachments to other young women, no crushes on boys. In the 1880s, Sarah started a relationship with another woman, Annie Adams Fields, that lasted for about 30 years. And if you've ever heard the phrase Boston marriage in reference to two women living together in the end of the 19th century, that phrase was coined more or less in reference to Sarah and Annie. So she's one of the OG 19th century lesbians. And the novel of Sarah's that I want to particularly talk about is The Country of the Pointed Firs, which I really recommend. It's a great book. It's kind of weird. The narrator is never named, but Meaghan, if you would. This is from chapter 10, where Pennyroyal grew. And the narrator is a woman who has come up to this little town of Dunnett's Landing on the Maine coast to do some writing. And she becomes very, very close to her landlady, Mrs. Todd. This is from a chapter where Mrs. Todd has taken the narrator out to a little island where Mrs. Todd's mother, Mrs. Blackett, lives. And while Mrs. Blackett is taking her afternoon nap, Mrs. Todd and the narrator go to a lonely place that faced northward. Among the grass grew such pennyroyal as the rest of the world could not provide. There's nothing like it, she said. Oh no, there's no such pennyroyal as this in the state of Maine. It's the right pattern of the plant, and all the rest I ever see is but an imitation. Don't it do you good? And I answered with enthusiasm. There, dear, I never showed nobody else but mother where to find this place. It's kind of sainted to me. Nathan, my husband, and I used to love this place when we was courtin'. So, to backstep slightly, in this chapter, Mrs. Todd has introduced the narrator to her mother, and then she brings the narrator to a place that Mr. Todd and Mrs. Todd used to hang out. And for the record, Mr. Todd died in a shipwreck before the novel starts. So he's, again, not a character, not in the picture. We can forget about him. So there's a parallel between the narrator and Mr. Todd, that they're on a level, courtship. As a side note also, Pennyroyal, or Mrs. Todd is an herbalist, and there's a lot in the novel about kind of her gentle rivalry with the town doctor. So I looked up what pennyroyal does in herbal medicine. It can bring on the menstrual cycle and also cause abortions. So it's a very female-coded herb, if you will. If you jump to the next slide, please, Meaghan. This is from the very end of chapter 12, when Mrs. Fosdick comes to visit. And Mrs. Fosdick and Mrs. Todd are old friends. They're just kind of sitting around talking about friendship. This is Mrs. Todd speaking. Yes, old friends is always best, lest you can catch a new one that's fit to make an old one out of. And we gave an affectionate glance at each other, which Mrs. Fosdick could not have understood, being the latest comer to the house. Like I was saying with that letter of Emily Dickinson's, there's close female friendship and there's something else. And this, again, falls into that something else category. Because Mrs. Todd and Mrs. Fosdick, they are themselves old friends. The relationship between Mrs. Todd and the narrator, it's different, it's more. There's something that we have missed that Jewett has chosen to not show us. The last particularly gay moment in The Country of the Pointed Firs is the next chapter, Poor Joanna. Joanna was a cousin of Mr. Todd's, and it's Mrs. Todd and Mrs. Fosdick talking about this woman who's no longer alive. Joanna had always wanted someone to look after, and she was kind of fixated on a particular man who abandoned her about a month before the wedding. He ran off with some other woman. Again, the man, not a part of the story. Let's forget about him. And after that, she retired from the world for good and all, though she was a well-off woman. All she wanted was to get away from folks. She thought she wasn't fit to live with anybody and wanted to be free. All her hopes were built on Marion and having a real home and somebody to look to. So that's kind of all that Joanna wants, is just not to have a man to look after, but to have someone to look after. And since this one particular guy that she had chosen, it doesn't work out, to heck with it. Let's go live on an island off the Maine coast, which is kind of relatable, actually. And this next passage on the page under the book cover, I had been reflecting upon a state of society which admitted such personal freedom and a voluntary hermitage. There was something medieval in the behavior of poor Joanna Todd under a disappointment of the heart. So I was talking about abbeys and convents earlier, and that's something similar, is that something medieval, well, at least in the United States, there weren't really Protestant abbeys. That was not a thing that was common. So she has to go back in time to get to that point. But it has the same idea, the same feeling of wanting to retreat from the world, just be by herself. She thought she wasn't fit to live with anybody. So Joanna Todd has some thought process or set of feelings that there's something within her that's not in sync with the rest of the world. What is that precisely? Well, looking at Sarah Orne Jewett's biography, we can say that Joanna Todd may well have been gay. To throw some somewhat more modern language in, of course, Joanna may also have been ace. That is also a trend that has been throughout human history. There have always been people who just haven't had sexual attraction to anybody. But like I said, I really recommend The Country of the Pointed Firs. And just noticing the time, it's almost 8. I want to make sure that if anyone has questions, you have a chance to ask them. So that was, like I said at the very beginning, a very brief introduction to some of the themes, those coded references which do pop up more and more in gay male literature, queer male literature of the 19th century. So for women, look at the writer's biography, see what was happening in their life, see what connections you can draw. And Meaghan and I both hoped very much that you go forth and do your own research, start reading, look at this lens with, use this lens to look at books that you read in high school English class that you, oh, I've always meant to read that. See what kind of a lens, see what you can find.
And we do have a couple recommended readings.
Yes.
Had to represent our boy, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Kavanaugh has a very intense female romantic friendship. I also highly recommend Joseph and His Friend, or anything by Henry James. So here's just some of them, and then we get a bit more into poetry on this slide. Anything by Oscar Wilde, anything by Emily Dickinson. I also highly recommend more poems by A.E. Hoosman. Oh, Who Is That Young Sinner is actually about Oscar Wilde. So there's a lot of great poetry there.
Have tissues when you read Oh, Who Is That Young Sinner, because it's a heartbreaker.
So to really wrap this up, the question we want to leave everyone with was, when was the first time you felt a deep connection to a story, and which story was it? So that's how we wanted to end that.
Well, thank you so much. We do have several questions in the chat. And if anyone, it's 7:58. If we go a couple minutes over, if folks have to leave, that's fine. I think it'll be okay if we stick around for a couple of extra minutes. And I'm happy to send out your list of recommended readings to everyone via email, probably tomorrow. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask, or no, I have a plug. Ken reminded me. So the History Project and Historic New Englander, we're co-sponsoring a Historic New England event in November with Dr. Don James McLaughlin about Sarah Orne Jewett, and I think it's called The First Gay American Novel, a Forgotten Book by Sarah Orne Jewett. Correct, Ken?
Ooh.
Good, okay. So come see us in November for that event if you're interested more in Sarah Orne Jewett. So I see Paul has his hand raised, so I will unmute you.
I want to say this is a great talk. You know, I've been invited to a couple of these sessions over the past couple of months as, you know, something to really continue to educate on during the pandemic. And as a gay man, I will say that the last talk that I went to was, I believe, about Sam Longfellow, and this one has been a really nice venture into LGBT literature over the years. And what I will say is, like, every time I come to one of these sessions, it's another opportunity for me to learn about LGBT history. And frankly, I know nothing about it. So I think that this is a great opportunity, and this is a great resource for LGBT folks in the community to learn a little bit about their history. So yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say.
Thank you. We've been doing a lot of queer history at Longfellow House, and as a queer English major in undergrad, this was great. I claimed the title of literary ranger this summer. So it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I know that it comforts me to know that there have been people like me throughout history, and people writing about sort of some of the same thoughts and feelings that I've had. So I'm really glad that you appreciate what we're doing.
Yeah, so do we have any other questions that folks, okay. Ken, here you go. I see your physical hand.
So come back and tell us about Willa Cather.
Oh
Cather.
gosh.
You can do that as another lecture.
Okay, I need to do a little bit more research. She's also, I think, late 19th, straddling more into the early 20th century, so a little bit outside the bounds of my comfort zone, to be entirely frank. I'm very much a 19th century and earlier person, but we'll have a part 2.
Excellent. So, Dave, I'm going to hold you to that. Dave, I'm going to unmute you. Or, there you are.
Any thoughts about Bram Stoker?
Ooh, I have a lot of thoughts about him. What specifically would you like to know?
I became very intrigued with his infatuation, I guess, with Walt Whitman.
Yeah, Bram Stoker was definitely another student of Walt Whitman. I don't have the letter in front of me, but basically he writes this very passionate letter to Walt Whitman talking about how Whitman's poetry made him like feel alive for the first time. It inspired him. No one has ever understood him like Walt Whitman did. It's not very coded. Bram Stoker definitely had some very passionate thoughts about Walt Whitman, as did Oscar Wilde and Sam Longfellow and half the people attending Oxford and Harvard. And I know Bram Stoker also had a very complex and interesting relationship with, what is his name? The actor. I'm completely blanking on the name now, but like Bram Stoker had some very interesting relationships with men. He was also married. So there's, again, complexities of talking about 19th century, but he did have some, Henry Irving, thank you, Meaghan. Yeah, passionate, complex relationship with the actor Henry Irving as well. So a lot of thoughts about Bram Stoker. I could rant about him all night. Again, he was one of the people I cut because I just didn't have enough time.
So in the chat, so there's mention Willa Cather. There's going to be a bio coming out written by a Smithy. We love Smithies. Sue mentions Louisa May Alcott, Anne Lister, Kate Chopin. I can think of some other women to add to that list from this time period. Final question before I release you all into your 8 p.m. cocktail hour. Do you find BIPOC writers during this time period, or any examples that we might want to add to the references?
So I, as a personal project, ever since June, have been trying to read more 19th century. What is the description I set for myself? Black female 19th century writers. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, amazing, absolutely amazing. I haven't found any evidence that she was queer. You do see a lot, or a fair number of queer Black women writers in the early 20th century with the Harlem Renaissance. Before that, I haven't found many. There are also not that many Black writers in the 19th century. F.E. Waller-Smith, like I said, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Jessie Redmond Fawcett. Who else have I been posting?
I was thinking Angelina Weld Grimke, although she's a little bit later in time than you're talking about here, but
yeah. And so that's mostly, like I said, just Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Everything that I've read of hers is amazing. Bury Me in a Free Land. Ooh, punch to the gut. So where you no, it's train of thought going fuzzy. I haven't found any queer Black writers, queer POC writers in the 19th century. That doesn't mean they don't exist, just that I have not come across them in my research and my reading.
It's something that we do need to dig into, and it's something that we've really tried to find to quote on this talk. It's just didn't it's going to require some digging for sure. I do know that in the past few years, there have been a number of books written about the subject of, being a queer person of color in the 19th century. I know there's one specifically on transgender identity in the 19th century. So that intersection of being Black and being trans in the 19th century. And I do want to get my hands on that book. It looked really interesting. So there is a lot of research being done, and it's something that I absolutely want to study more myself for sure.
Yeah, and if you send me the name of that book, I will include it in the follow-up email to everyone that was here tonight so that we can all add these books and poems to our further reading list, which, at least for me, is never ending after these talks. So 6 after 8, I promised you all you could leave and have your 8 p.m. cocktail. So with that, thank you all for being here. I look forward to seeing you at some of these events in the future. We'll be here next Thursday. The announcement hasn't gone out yet, so this is special for you all, with Rebecca Sheffield, who is a queer archivist from Canada who just released a book called Documenting Rebellions on queer community archives in America and Canada. So it'll be fun. Thank you all. Have a good night and see you soon.